So this is sort of a general outline of how we wanted to proceed. We're going to start, of course, first with the fact that we designated the whole island as a groundwater management area, and we have these applications for existing use, which is one of the first things that comes up. Applications to continue existing use. Following that, we thought we would touch on the Molokai Water Working Group, why we had it, why we no longer have it, what it was supposed to do, and how it was going to go about doing that. And then come back and begin looking at establishing the existing use for the permits, which was the first thing out after designation. We were also going to touch on what are the issues that are important on Molokai, both from the Waiola case and the Kukui case, but we have been advised that it's really going to be up to the attorneys to determine what these issues are. And so we've been asked to leave that one on the side. From that point, we go on to the new use applications, since we do have existing use permits, and we've had applications for new uses to build onto those. And we also have this USGS groundwater model, which is sort of the last of a series of work that has been done by USGS, and it's one that a lot of people are waiting upon to help guide their participation as we proceed. And then just a note at the end on kind of where we are and how to move forward. So to begin with, there are these maps here. The Kualapu Aquifer is that red thing right in the middle. Molokai consists of two volcanoes. The East Molokai volcano is the one primarily in green, which is the caldera facing north, and about half of that caldera is actually gone. It's subsided into the ocean. The flank flows are the stuff in purple. The green is mostly the valleys, the remaining of the caldera. The flows also move west through the red Kualapu Aquifer, as well as the two other central sort of brown aquifers. The West Molokai volcano is the one that you see in beige, with two aquifer system areas. Here's a little bit of a close-up showing the blue boundaries around the Kualapu Aquifer. You can see Kamakakai down there at the bottom, and Kalaupapa up on the top, and Ho'olahua out to the west. I've identified 5 different wells of interest. There's 4 right there in the center, all fairly close together. 2 DHHL wells, 1 Maui County well, and our Molokai Ranch well. And just over the boundary, which I should elaborate a little bit more, you'll see one more there's called the Waiola well that was proposed, has not been constructed, but was the subject of the Waiola contested case. I was going to make a note that the boundaries there don't distinguish between sector and system boundaries, but I wanted to do that because there's a purpose in that. To the south of the Kualapu Aquifer, where you see that other little red pin, that's a sector boundary, meaning that it's expected that not much water flows between the two. And also the boundary on the east, going into the caldera, we have flows going in opposite directions from that line, that boundary. And so that also is a sector boundary. And the expectation is that not much water flows between the two. By contrast, the aquifers to the west and south, down towards Kaunaka, well, it's actually on Umipa'a that you see on that one, and Ho'olahua. Those are system boundaries, and we do expect to see water flowing across those boundaries. But they are there for planning purposes.
So, Charlie, the Waiola wells would not receive water from the Kualapu hydrologic
it would be very limited. One of the things that we found from the USGS work in the past was that there's very little data because there are so few wells. So there's not really a good way to totally calibrate what the effect might be. But because there are signs of hydrogeological boundaries, there are vents there that suggest a curtain of impermeable lavas that run roughly in that along that boundary. The expectation is for very reduced, if any, flows between those on either side of those boundaries. Zooming in again to the four wells right there in the central Kualapu well field. You'll see three in very close proximity, the two DHHL wells on the right, the Maui County well to the left of it in the center, and off a little bit at a greater distance, the Molokai Public Utilities well, or Molokai Ranch well, well 17. This is of interest for you to see that there is interaction that has been noticed between the county well and the DHHL wells, although we are not necessarily seeing an interaction with the well 17 and the others. In 1990, we received a petition from the community, very interested in designating the entire island to assure protection of its limited water resources, Native Hawaiian water rights, the perceived potential overdevelopment of the island, somewhat inadequate planning in their view, and serious disputes that continue. At that time, staff could see that the Kualapu Aquifer certainly was a good candidate for designation, but the commission went along with the community, which was very strong on this point. There were some very pointed points of view expressed at public hearings on that, so the commission designated the entire island. The effective date of that was July 15th, 92, which triggers 1 year for people who have existing use to apply to continue that existing use. And the deadline was the following year, 93, July 15th. Now to step back just for a moment and look at the Molokai Water Working Group. This was originally convened in 93 in view of the community's strong interest in aquifer designation and water planning, and the fact that we did not have what the commission considered adequate guidance from the county's water use and development plan at the time. And Bill Patey's charge to the group was good faith deliberations aimed at producing the highest consensus possible on demand forecast, bulk water allocations, recommendations to manage both supply and demand, and the best plans on balancing future use. There were two specified purposes for convening the Molokai Water Working Group. One was to recommend a plan for water development that could assist the county in moving its water use and development plan forward, in lieu of actually having had a county plan developed already. And the other was to test a community working group model, and if it worked, could be used elsewhere where communities are faced with tough water planning issues. In 1996, there arose this issue of whether the estimated sustainable yield at Kualapu was the correct number. We found some mathematical errors in the computation. And so in anticipation of the possible change of the sustainable estimate from 7 to 5 million gallons per day, Mike Wilson asked that we reconvene the group to kind of see how things looked in view of that possibility. And then a third time it was reconvened by Peter Young. This was about the time of the La'au Point controversies, and there were a number of different factions on the island that were concerned about various issues, and it seemed like there was an intense interest within the community, again, to reconvene the group and to look at these issues in more detail and to try to develop a broader perspective on things. In this particular case, the staff wanted to make the point that we were handing this project off to the county. The idea of having a water use and development plan was something that the county was prepared to pick up the ball on. And so we actually handed off the baton to them. After 7 sessions that the commission conducted, we turned it over to the county, and they conducted the 3 last sessions as the Water Advisory Committee for their water use and development plan. Yes.
So I'm trying to understand. So the sustainable yield, and that's for the whole Kuala Pua area, was it 7 and then was reduced to 5?
Yes.
What was that based on, and what impacts did that have? I don't know how much pumping was going on there.
All of the aquifers have been estimated by John Mink, who did a lot of groundwork trying to understand what are the factors involved with that, and he did some complex mathematical formalizations derived from rainfall and water balance and a variety of things. And in some cases, there was a lot of good information available, and so that his estimates were considered very sound, and he felt very confident in them. And others he felt maybe were based on less data and maybe not so strong information, and so they would be considered somewhat to be taken under advisement. As it turns out, I don't know whether you remember, Roy, but there was some factor in his calculation that we found a mathematical error, actually. So consequently, the way it worked out was the estimate probably should have been 5 rather than 7.
So in other words, it was the mathematics of the REM model, similar to when the 1991 Maui Water Use and Development Plan came out, and the numbers were changed for that. It was not
Right.
from empirical evidence of upconing or
No, that's correct.
transition zone movement.
That's correct.
But it was never ground truth because there was no monitoring points.
Right. Right.
And how much was being pumped then?
I think at the time it was something less than 2 million gallons per day, with the bulk of that coming from well 17.
In other words, it's stuff that was feeding the resort.
Yes. And the other 1 million was split between the county and DHHL, roughly speaking. I actually want to jump ahead. This one's a little bit out of sequence, I think, for the logic of it. So as the deadline is coming up for July 15th of 1993, we're expecting to have these applications come in. The first one that came in was in March from the Molokai irrigation system and from Molokai Ranch, oddly enough. And what they were applying for is the 10% that well 17 injects into the Molokai irrigation system to be transported to Mahana, where from there it's pumped up to Pu'unana, where there is a treatment plant, and from there it goes down to Kaluakoi Resort. So that there was a transactional agreement there for them to supply 10% in excess of what is used at Kaluakoi to account for system losses in that system. So they were actually first out of the gate in requesting an application.
How much gallons is that?
I think it would be on the order of maybe 100,000, something like that. In June, the Department of Water Supply, the County Department of Water Supply, applied for both existing and foreseeable uses from their Kualapu'umauka well. I notice there's a little typo there. It's Kualapu. In July 6th, then the Department of Hawaiian Homelands followed with their application both for existing and foreseeable use from their Ku'uluwai wells 1 and 2. And finally, just a couple of days before the deadline, Kukui Molokai, KMI, filed their application solely for existing water use at 2 million gallons per day.
I'm a little confused about the March 9th application and the July 13th application for, I mean, it was KMI a different entity than Molokai Irrigation System and Molokai Ranch?
Those are 3 different entities.
Even though they all pump out of well 17.
The Molokai irrigation system is primarily served from Waikolu Valley. There's a major federal project back in the 60s, I think.
That's a big reservoir.
And it comes through that 5-mile tunnel and is piped over to the Kualapu Reservoir, holds something like 1 billion gallons, one of the largest at the time. But well 17 actually serves Kaluakoi Resort, and it was using the Molokai irrigation system to transport the water since it was unable to get a pipeline of its own. Interestingly enough,
So they put 100,000 in over here and then take out 100,000 over there.
well, it's 100,000 in addition to the amounts that they extract from Mahana, so that it's 10% in addition to the amount that they take out. So it's calibrated depending on what they remove. Yeah. Molokai Ranch also has a mountain system that collects surface water flow, and that is piped through an easement through the Hawaiian Homelands to Mauna Loa, which is used distinctly from Kaluakoi.
But that's coming from further east and
Yes.
transporting all the way across.
Yes. So this may figure in the future, but at this point anyway, the Molokai irrigation system is the way to transport well 17 water to Kaluakoi. So ultimately, these were combined because obviously the 3 are all interconnected.
And that's in tunnel and open ditch.
I'm not sure about a tunnel.
So the applications were combined, is what he said. The 3 applications.
For the actual transport, it's all transported in open ditch, or is there? I think you mentioned a tunnel.
Oh, there is a tunnel from Waikolu that comes out just above Kanukakai, and then from there is piped to Kualapu Reservoir. That's where the bulk of the MIS water comes from. Yeah.
Captures all the reservoir, everything from the tunnel and the wells go into the reservoir, and then from there it's piped where it's needed.
Right. Yeah, it's also true that the well 17 water on its route through that system does first enter the Kualapu Reservoir, and then from there it goes on through the system. So, the Maui County and the DHHL applications were accepted as complete by the filing deadline. The Molokai Irrigation System, Molokai Ranch, and Kukui Molokai application was not accepted as complete by the deadline, as there were a number of questions about full accounting of end use. And we did go back and forth with KMI concerning existing use, as the code is kind of specific about its actual existing use at the time of designation. versus KMI's representation that their existing land use approvals meant that they needed to be prepared to provide service to all of those, so that they were counting all of that potential service as existing. So we kind of went back and forth on that.
And how'd that end up?
Well, as it happens, we stuck to our position where, as much as possible, we tried to get information that could tell us what was exactly being used at the time of designation, and they continued to press for what they were hoping would be considered their existing potential use. So in September of '93, the commission approved DHHL's water use permit for existing use, .367, and deferred the request for new uses pending the accounting for all other existing uses or the approval of the water reservation. 6 months later, the commission approved the water reservation for Department of Hawaiian Homelands of what at that point was considered to be probably the balance of the sustainable yield at the time. The balance actually being around 5. This is slightly ahead of the Commission's official adoption of 5 as the sustainable yield, but was anticipated already at this point. So the Commission did approve a reservation for essentially the balance of what was the sustainable yield. On that same day, same meeting, the Commission approved KMI's water use permit for 0.871 for existing uses and deferring new uses pending the establishment of all existing uses from the aquifer. And then in October of '95, the Commission approved the Maui County's water use permit as the existing use. And at that point, it was a little bit clearer, a little bit closer coming up, the fact that we were going to have this math correction of the sustainable yield figure. And so the Commission deferred requests for new uses, even though other existing uses had been approved by that point, because they wanted to be sure that the sustainable yield estimate was going to be confirmed and we'd be able to move forward on a solid footing. They provided, however, that the current pumpage, which was 3 years later after designation, and so therefore it had increased somewhat from the original amount that had been existing in '92. They have provided for that current pumpage to be maintained until they were able to apply for new uses in addition to what they received. Okay, now at this point I want to go back. This gives a little bit more detailed history on how we went around with KMI. Staff originally recommended amending the amount of the existing use from their requested 2 to 1.275. And at that point, we had a request for a contested case hearing. And so the action was deferred until there could be a standing, termination of standing.
Whose existing use?
This is the Kukui Molokai, the Kuluakoi Resort. So they had requested 2, and as far as we could tell at that time, what was existing at the time was actually 1.275, so that was the staff's recommendation.
Okay.
We came back 5 months later with new information, thinking that actually the amount of existing was 1.183, not 1.275.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I'm sorry.
That was with the golf course and the resort in full operation?
Yes. And then about 6 months later, the staff had more information, and so that was the basis for determining that the existing use was only 0.871, and that's the figure that the Commission finally adopted and approved for their use.
from 2 down to 0.871 after a few go-rounds
Yes.
with staff.
Right.
Evaluating what was considered existing use.
And the 871, that included the golf course irrigation?
Yes. They have a system whereby they reprocess water from the resort through a recapture system, and that was being used on the golf course, so they were able to supplement that somewhat. Subsequent to that decision, KMI of course moved to reconsider, seeking the larger amount. The commission denied the reconsideration. KMI appealed to both Circuit Court and to the Supreme Court. The Circuit Court dismissed it without prejudice, saying that the administrative remedies had not been fully exercised yet. They had an existing use permit and could always apply for a new use permit. And the Supreme Court also dismissed the case for lack of jurisdiction at that point. Okay, so now I'll move back to here. So as the Kaluakoi Resorts application went to contested case, new uses were added in to the existing uses because the other existing uses had been considered already. DHHL made an application for additional water, a new use application. And because this issue had been kind of simmering, bubbling up, it was apparent already at that point that there was interference between the DHHL wells and the county well. Yes?
I want to go back just a tiny bit. At that point in time, 95, there was a sustainable yield in place of 5. And how much permits had been issued against the 5? If you take the reduced amount for Kaluakoi and the DHHL reservation and the county, etc.
I think what, 2.8, on that.
1.6.
Oh.
1.7.
Well, plus the DHHL reservation.
Yeah, or if you add the reservation.
Right.
Yeah,
So it comes out to just less than 5.
just less than 5.
So in other words, the 5 was pretty much allocated
Close,
at that
yeah.
point.
Yes.
Yes. So, I think that the amount that DHHL was requesting at the time fell within what was the remainder, although they would have taken it from their reservation.
Yeah, they weren't asking for additional reservation, they were asking to utilize the
Some from their
reservation that had
reservation.
previously been approved.
Correct. Yeah. But due to this well interference issue, we asked them to take a look at that, please, before we proceeded with it. We wanted to sort out what that is. The state does have an anti-degradation policy, and we wanted to abide by that and not to have a problem with increased salinity in those wells, which is coming up here. We are beginning to see a jump in the chlorine, chlorides. Yeah. Maui County also applied for additional well withdrawals, and we asked them the same thing before we actually acted on it at all. We put them sort of to the same test. Can you folks take a look at this and figure out how we're going to proceed without having additional well interference? The pumpage seemed to be in that area between those 3 wells. And we wanted to avoid overpumping the aquifer at that location and risk degradation of the water quality. So then sometime later, quite a number of years later, Molokai Public Utilities has reapplied for their application, which kind of brings us to the current time where we have these three different applications that are actually in conflict. And there's three different sources of conflict. One is that the sustainable yield as it is now would be exceeded if we were to approve as requested. The second is well interference between some of these wells. And the third is a conflict, potential conflict with other public trust uses, which I'll come to in a moment. This is what the Water Code has to say about competing uses, competing applications. Section 54 says that if two or more applications which otherwise comply with this section are pending for a quantity that is inadequate, or which for any other reason are in conflict, say well interference, for example, the Commission shall first seek to allocate and in such a way as to accommodate applications as possible, and second, if mutual sharing is not possible, approve applications which best serve the public interest. That's what the code says.
Charlie, can you just go back one slide?
Mhm.
The common public trust purposes, can you just talk a little bit about what are the public trust purposes that are in conflict on this issue?
Yeah, actually, that's slide 21. Slide 21. They are, and three of them are first defined in the Waiahole decision, which comes out at the very end of the contested case of the Kukui Molokai contested case. Right in fact, after the hearing has been closed and during the final decision making, we finally get the Waiahole decision coming down. And it identifies three public trust purposes. One is maintenance of waters in their natural state, which is resource protection. Two is domestic use, primarily drinking water. Three is traditional and customary practices, which are indigenous practices to maintain and to enjoy common resources. And then the Waiahole case actually preceded the contested case for Kukui Molokai. You haven't mentioned that one, but it actually is in your detailed timeline. It actually proceeded prior to this. And a fourth public trust purpose was identified by the court at that point, which was that DHHL water reservations for future reasonable and beneficial use are considered. And given that, I think by extension it assumes that future uses by DHHL might be considered a public trust use as well. So that, yeah.
Yeah, the maintenance of waters in their natural state, how is that pertinent to this issue? We don't have any conflict with that, huh?
So, there, I don't know where it is in your hydrology, but there's an issue that's raised about spring water on the shore. And the maintenance of the beds.
Okay, Momomi, that's like a
No,
Momomi.
it's on the south side.
Waikolu, I know they're taking water out of Waikolu stream, less, is that been, I'm just trying to drill down a little bit on.
Yeah.
I understand the DHHL reservations. I'm assuming the domestic use primary drinking water, we can tease out drinking water from ag water, at least to have some context for that. I understand traditional and customary practices, I don't know how much that's been fleshed out in quantity. I'm just trying to see if the maintenance of water in natural
Mhm.
states. So we
Yeah.
have potential springs and nearshore ocean.
Yeah, fair question. I'm not sure that we know exactly what it's going to be, but the issue here, or what's being presented as the issue, which would be relevant on this one, is that pumping from wells would diminish in equal part the discharge of groundwater to the nearshore environment. And so insofar as the natural flow of groundwater to the nearshore environment is a relevant issue, then it is affected by well pumping. So the question becomes, how much of an issue is that? And there's actually two parts to that. One is, if we know that there is a diminished flow, how does that impact the nearshore environment, and to what extent is that either a primary or some other kind of secondary impact on the situation there.
Okay, I'll be quiet for a while.
So it's
No.
will we, one more? Oh, okay. So, this is one of Roy's nice little diagrams, and I would direct your attention, first of all, I guess, just for clarity, to the very last row in that right-hand box, which shows a total, and it shows totals down the side of the DHHL. Well, if you would consider existing and new uses of 0.637, and the somewhat reduced reservation on that account of 2.635. Then you have Maui Department of Water Supply has the Waikalai Tunnel with an allocation of 0.036, as well as their Kualapu'u Mauka well, which has 0.516, and they have requested a new use from the Kualapu'u Mauka well in the amount of 0.384. So you see on the right-hand column there, both the Waikalai Tunnel of 0.036 and the Kualapu'u Mauka well of 0.900. And then now we also have the new application from Molokai Public Utilities, and their request is for 1.026. So when you add those, you see that we are in excess of the 5 million gallons sustainable yield. That's sort of the short version, and it's broken out a little bit to your left. Yeah.
Charlie, how much of the Maui Department of Water Supply 0.936 is for domestic use? Is any of it, in other words, is any of it ag or industrial, or is it all domestic?
I don't think we have an accounting on that, but they do have some commercial. I'm not sure they have industrial use. I don't know that they have much agricultural use other than what individual parties may use in their yards, but it's assumed that there may be some of that.
I mean, when looking at public trust use as domestic,
Yes.
I would assume that the Maui Department of Water Supply portion of it that's not a domestic use would be insignificant.
Yeah, I really can't answer to that since we don't have a good accounting. The only time when we've actually explored that somewhat was on Maui.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a different situation, so I won't make a comparison other than to note that what we were told at that instance was that about 60% of their total use in the municipal service area was actual domestic or residential use, and that the balance of it was commercial, industrial, other kinds of use.
And ag meter.
And I guess there is some ag metering. I'm told that there's not a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But my guess is that on Molokai, the residential portion of that is somewhat larger than that, quite a bit larger maybe. So the bulk of it I would consider to be probably residential. Whether that qualifies as domestic is an issue that hasn't been very thoroughly explored yet.
And the MPU, the Molokai Public Utilities, is there any feel for whether most of that is going to domestic, in other words, residential use, or it's going to other uses?
Most of that, currently anyway, is residential use. Some of it, I think, is also used for some local agriculture in the larger lots that they have. At this point, the hotel and the golf course are not functional, but this application requests enough to restore the hotel and the golf course to service.
Mm-hmm.
So their application is going to be including those things.
So it does include the golf
Yes.
and the landscape of
Yeah.
it.
And I think it also includes some agriculture, some livestock raising and whatnot.
Just a comment for all your PowerPoint people, you know, when you go to the community, you just gotta spell out the acronym. I know it's a pain, but, you know, for common citizens, they look at this thing and they just have no idea what you're talking about. Yeah. I know you kind of fits in titles, put it on the footnotes, but just keep spelling that stuff out so normal people know what you're talking about.
Well, hopefully your detailed timeline here, I tried to replace all of the acronyms with
Yeah.
actual words, so hopefully that's a backup for it in your instance.
Okay.
So is this current, this page 17?
Sorry?
Is this a current snapshot?
This is the current request, not the actual use. This is the application. It's a new use application. What the court said in its remand was that they have to reapply for everything as a new use. There's a detail there that staff had proposed to approve existing use
Mhm.
on an application that was not actually officially complete within a deadline that was pointed out to us was actually statutorily required.
Mhm.
So we felt that there was just cause for the delay in having it absolutely complete. And what the court said was that no longer applies. Just cause does not apply. And that they had to proceed on the basis that because they missed the deadline, there was an assumption that KMI was abandoning the use, even though they were going through a contested case to be sure that they had the use. But anyway, that's just a detail. The technicality is they needed to reapply for everything as a new use, so.
So
that's-
all of this is looked at it as a new,
Correct,
a new water use permit application.
correct. And so,
And we're busting the sustainable yield by 250,000 gallons a day if all were to be, accepted, though we know that DHHL is not using their portion, but it would seem that their reservation is sacrosanct, whether it's being used or not.
it's a public trust use.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this would be a paper over allocation
Right, right.
in the near term, but in the long term, if everyone was to use up to their allocation, it would be.
It's an illustration that, just in terms of conflicting use or competing applications, according to the code, we're over the sustainable yield, and therefore there has to be some accommodation. And so, however it is that the commission finds its way to allocation, they are at this point, under the terms of the code, competing applications.
Okay, and the only kind of new additional use is Maui Department of Water Supply, which is domestic or a public trust use. But the MPU is kind of from before. I don't know how to state that.
Yeah.
Portions from before.
A portion is from before for MPU. There's additional use both for requested additional new use for Department of Water Supply and for DHHL.
Okay, but there's no additional requested use for MPU at this time.
I think there's some things, like for example, the golf course doesn't even, they're not using it anymore. They turn it back on, that's under use at this point in time, so there's some new use.
So there's some new use.
Yeah, their existing use, their existing pumpage is less than 1 million. I forget exactly, and I think it shows up in here subsequently, but.
Should let you continue. Sounds like you're getting there.
Well, but these are good questions.
Yeah, you got to clarify, so it's.
This is not the very best example, but what you see in the heavy green line is the 12-month moving average. This is data from DHHL well number 1, showing the chlorides on the right-hand side. And what this is meant to illustrate is that over on the right-hand side, you see the Maui Department of Water Supply Kuala Pu'umauka well coming online. And so you see the overall pumpage increase. But we also see these little blips of chlorides moving up a little bit. So we do see a jump in some of the chlorides in DHHL well number 1
When Maui is pumping.
when Maui starts pumping.
There's a connection between,
Yeah.
the interference is a better word.
Moving average is just the DHHL well or
No,
all?
it's all.
Total?
Yeah,
Got it.
total. And this may be a little bit better when the blue line shows the 12-month moving average. The little red ones are the monthly pumpages. Along the bottom, you see the dark black pumpage from well number 1. This is 2 graphs, top and bottom, for Kuapu Aquifer, DHHL wells 1 and 2. So you'll see a different pattern in the pumpage between well and 2, 1 and 2. But again, you also see on the right-hand side of well 1, you see the chloride in green blips moving up, whereas the chloride blips on well number 2 seem somewhat more stable. So there's some anomalous condition between the 2 DHHL wells. But we are seeing interference with the county well in well number 1 for DHHL.
Just a quick question, what's the minimum amount of chlorides for drinking water? I mean, what's the number you shoot for?
The EPA's secondary guideline for chlorides is 250 milligrams per liter or parts per million. And so we're down at
You okay?
something of 100. I've actually seen, this data ends in 98, by the way. There has been more pumpage in latter years, and so we are hoping to get some better data than we've had. Some of this is kind of spotty, so we're seeing a pattern here, which is of concern. But we need to get better chloride reporting from all of these players. But I have seen chlorides as high as 190 in the DHHL well, one of the wells. So there is cause for concern.
But you see a distinct pattern of increased chlorides when the county came on with its.
Correct. And this is the county's well. It shows kind of a similar pattern. You see their pumpage coming online over on the right-hand corner, the heavy black in the back on the right. And the early testing, you can see a little green blip on to the left of that, and then you see an increase in chloride somewhat, but still a little bit lower than we see in the DHHL well. So somehow the county well is faring a little bit better than the DHHL well number 1 for some reason. But they are obviously interacting. I think we have visited this one. Is there any other questions about public trust purposes?
Just the MPU request is probably not domestic use?
Well,
Or a small
I would have to qualify the use of the term domestic. We
Yeah.
prefer not to use the word domestic simply because the code refers to the use of domestic, and it kind of goes back to an older time when the use of domestic was very different from what residential use is today. And so we have had questions raised about whether the typical amount of service to residential purposes is in fact what was meant by domestic use.
So this primary drinking water, which I always see in the policies, isn't that in the code?
Not exactly. No,
Okay.
it's
I'll do my homework.
it's the idea of domestic water, which at the time was considered to be drinking water, some hygiene and bathing water and so forth. Probably not washing cars, probably not irrigating lawns, probably not dishwashers and laundry and so on, which is kind of par for the course now.
I can read to you what the code defines domestic use.
Please,
Okay?
sorry.
Domestic use is defined under 174(3) definitions, means any use of water for individual personal needs and for household purposes such as drinking, bathing, heating, cooking, non-commercial gardening, and sanitation.
I do think this is an area that may need some discussion and clarification by this commission at some point. I know, kind of on the ground, at least on Maui, there's an amount that is your average for communities that do very little landscaping. And, you know, parts of central Maui and parts of multifamily and so on, where it might be closer to the Oahu averages in the 300 gallons per day per household. Then there's, you know, areas that have a lawn that may be a little bit brown, but it's still a small lawn, which might be running 500 gallons per day. And then there's many of the newer communities, and particularly the resort communities, where it tends to be 1,500, 2,000 gallons per day. And, you know, I think that may be actually something that would fall into play in the West Molokai resort areas versus, say, households in Kaunakakai. But I really don't know what the mechanism should be in trying to evaluate what uses are protected, public trust uses versus those which are not.
Yeah, I think that's gonna be a very large question. Obviously, the numbers that are used by the county are kind of planning numbers, and it's based on that range that you're talking about. Maui County tends to be well, it is the highest in terms of its kind of standard figure of 600 gallons per unit per day. Kauai has 400, for example. Both Oahu and Hawaii use 500 gallons per day, per household.
But Oahu.
Oahu is 500.
500.
Yeah, but these are general averaging planning numbers when they're projecting, and it could be that from one region to another, there is a lot of variation. I know that in some older parts that are kind of smaller lots, the use is even less than 400.
I mean, would it make sense if we were to be kind of evaluating this to take 5 or say 600, which is the highest average, and then start thinking that which goes beyond that is not domestic use?
I suspect that's a subject that needs to have a lot of input from a lot of different sources.
I know that we're working on the update of our water resource protection plan, and I know that that's something that, you know, might be coming out in the next year or so. And I don't know if that's something that's being taken into consideration in the water resource protection plan. I kind of hope that that's where that discussion should be.
Right, well, certainly as there's greater competition for water, there maybe needs to be some prioritization or some closer look at issues that have been sort of taken for granted to date, but, yeah.
If I may add as well, when a water use permit comes before the commission, several have come before you, and there's a portion in there about the domestic portion of the requesters amount. The staff never recommends beyond those averages, even though sometimes the applicant may request more. That's teased out into maybe irrigation needs or something separate from domestic, so it's kind of already addressed in the water use permit application right now.
I know in the discussions we've had regarding issuing of new water use permits, like the ones last month, although we were bumping up against the sustainable yield of the aquifer segment, we were not really talking about whether they were a public trust use or not. You know, they were for water and stock and so on. If another use were to come along asking for a permit in that same place, you know, whether it's here or whether it's on North Oahu. I mean, there, the sustainable yield is already subscribed at 5, and then the new use was for a true domestic use or a TNC use. Would, at that point, we be evaluating it on that basis?
The location exists to make room for the public trust fund. That was done, and actually why we were, more so because of the cessation of sugarcane, but there were applications for new uses. It wasn't enough, and we had to revoke the unused water. But similarly, if it got to the point where, hey, okay, here's a domestic use or a public trust fund with over, where can it be found? So we have to evaluate all the water use permits on the aquifer system area.
It's another reason why we have requested applicants to explore alternative uses or alternative sources rather. And that's one that will come up surely when we start looking at these applications here. Being that well 17 provides really excellent potable water, is that what, how you want to make, what sort of priorities do you want to assign to that? And are there alternative sources that need to be explored so that we have that full picture? You can make a decision that covers all of those concerns. So coming back to this particular set of wells, this is where we have some of the well interference issues. And these are the wells that we have the main applications for that are of some interest. And I'm going to go on to another one of Roy's nice diagrams here.
Nice work, Roy. That's a good one.
Yeah, this is a visual representation of the timeline and a number of the points of interest, the activities that have occurred. It distinguishes between applications that were for existing use and those that are for new use. And as you can see, a number of the applications have been on hold for some time. And they have been operating on existing use for some time, and they're probably, I think in all cases, running behind in terms of being able to pump their correct allocation. This also shows you, up on the top here, there's some events that come along. The Supreme Court's decision on Waiahole appears just before the decision in order for the KMI case. And the decisions in Waiola, some 6 or 7 years later, comes immediately before their decision in the KMI case, which is a remand. In the Waiola case, by the way, that was appealed, but Molokai Public Utilities at the time chose to walk away from that application. So there has been no well care, there's no water use. Yeah.
Around 2003 or so, I was on the Maui Board of Water Supply, and I remember spending a day traveling around looking at well sites. I forget if Jeff was there at that time or not.
I was there when you were on the board, I know that.
Yeah, we over on Molokai when I
I don't
cruised
remember
around.
that, but that doesn't mean I wasn't there.
And I remember looking at one site that I assume was Waiola. I remember it was kind of a little bit to the west and a little bit south of the existing well field. Then there was another one kind of higher up, kind of on the way to the Kalapapa Trail and the coffee. And then there was another one kind of out further west, which I think that was up in Molokai Ranch property. I don't know if any of those were ever put into play other than, I guess the Wyola one, which was right over the boundary outside.
I recall that there were applications for some wells, maybe a couple of wells, for a golf course that was sort of in the Kalai area, which is on the way towards Kalaupapa when you leave Winahua. And there was quite a bit of controversy over those, and they essentially never were granted. They were never approved. So there isn't any use there. I think there are some very small wells, some tunnels maybe even that supply a little bit of water. Waikalai Tunnel is sort of up in that area too, and it's a fairly minimal amount of water.
But
yeah.
there were never any exploratory wells drilled.
No, they were applied for, but they raised that controversy and were rejected, essentially. The other one I was going to mention, the one of which was the Wyola well. If you're familiar with Molokai, the west portal of that tunnel that comes from Waikolu, the Wyola well is sort of up on that same ridge. It's fairly near the west portal, so it's north of Kaunakakai, Mauka of Kaunakakai. And it's over on the same side. There's a Kakalahale well, which is a little bit to the west of that, and it's just downslope from a major vent, Lua Wai, and it has pretty salty water. So that's sort of a confirmation of the idea that this line of vents that comes down along that sectoral boundary kind of prevents what you might expect to be flowing from the caldera in a more southerly direction into Kaunakakai. So I think because the Wyola well was over in the Kamiloloa aquifer and a little bit higher up, that it was hoping to achieve better results. But it was never drilled, we don't know.
Was that gonna be a DWS hole, or was that gonna be on Molokai?
That was the Molokai Public Utilities proposal.
Didn't DWS have plans to do at least a test well?
We understand that there is a move afoot on that order now. If there has been discussion in the past, it hasn't really reached our shores. Roy, is there anything else you want to mention about? Some highlights?
It's just a summary of everything that's described or on one page for reference, time-wise, party-wise, amount-wise, existing versus
Yeah.
new. So it's a summary.
Yeah, part of what you see here in terms of this extended length of why isn't anything happening there is due to the fact that between the time that we initially approved a permit for Kukui Molokai, it went to appeal, and so I think little was done at that time. And when the remand came down, when the Supreme Court finally did rule several years later, Molokai Public Utilities at that time was going to walk away from the situation. The PUC stepped in and said, well, you know, you do have customers out there who rely on service for public health and safety. And so they opened a docket to consider what would be appropriate rates to make that system viable. And they did approve new rates so that Molokai Ranch has stepped back in now, Molokai Public Utilities, and eventually did reapply for servicing the west end.
So Charlie was describing that black bar.
Yeah.
In the middle.
So the following chart, the NPU historic pumpage, that's well 17?
Yes.
Yeah,
Let's
oh, okay.
move on to that.
Okay.
this is showing that above the allocation, in the red line, the horizontal red line, we now have a bit of overpumpage from DHHL's well.
That over pumpage, does that break the moving average, the 12-month moving average, or just the shorter term overage?
Well, as it happens, the 12-month moving average is sort of a temporary overpumpage. Yeah.
Green.
And
The green goes above.
the dark green line
So
is.
the green is the 12-month.
Yeah, right. And Maui County also has been overpumping. You can sort of see that red line, which is their allocation and how much overpumpage they have. And then moving to Molokai Public Utilities. Of course, the red line is at the bottom since the court has vacated their permit. It's interesting that.
But overpumpage, isn't there overpumpage here too? When you take a look at their
Well-
1 point.
By default, because their permit is vacated, they don't have a permit for any of this, right?
So they can pump as much as they want.
So we are really intent on kind of getting back to the case where we can determine whether or not they should have this water or not, get a permit for them or not. What is that amount that it should be?
Okay, but in January '93, they were over pumping. I mean, I'm just looking at the past two things compared to that, at least what historically they had. That's why I'm a little confused.
Well,
The
okay.
FPU historic pumping, we're talking well 17, right?
Right.
Yes, the
They
earlier.
never officially had a permit, so they can never officially overpump.
Any usage.
Way back, they requested a permit of, what was it, .8? Well, we approved the .8.
But
It's
the
like
actual
1.2, which is where, you know, the green line is around 93, but the commission approved .871, and then it went into contested
And
case.
then it went into the washing machine.
Right, and it's in there, and so,
Okay, but at that point, they were over pumping based on their sustainable.
No, I think the first two, the earlier two slides were for DHHL's well, which was overpumping, and
Not
Maui County well, which was
Just what
overpumping.
they have approved in their application for their permit.
So we would like to get to the fact that by default, NPU is also overpumping, but at this point, they don't have a permit yet, they don't have an allocation, we need to get to that, so that they will know what they can pump.
That's kind of the main reason we're here.
Yeah.
Trying to resolve that and the related issues behind or along with that.
Okay, but weren't they .871 MGD?
Correct,
Yeah.
but no, it was never approved.
well, it
Well,
was approved. It was
It
approved.
was approved and
But it was
appealed.
vacated by the court.
It was approved, appealed, and vacated.
Approved, and appealed, and
Okay, but pumping now, well 17 is being pumped right now.
Illegally.
Oh,
Yeah, and you
Public
can
trust
see,
issues on it.
you can see that their pumpage is pretty far below what they've actually asked for. The
but it's
12-month
not that
moving-
far below from what they were originally granted before the vacation.
Well, most of the 12-month moving average that you see across the middle of that diagram is approximately how much the original permit was for. So that turns out to be not a bad estimate of what they were actually using.
I'm sorry, I'm just looking from January '83 to '93, almost all the moving averages are closer exceeding what they were, but okay,
Well, it's.
it's a moot point.
Right, .871, yeah, I guess you're right.
Yeah. Man, I'm just seeing red hours over pumping in this one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So we would like to get to that. Okay, now, one of the things that may help us is this US GS groundwater modeling effort. There have actually been 3 previous phases to this effort. Back in '95, they put together a report that showed all the available information as a framework for trying to review groundwater conditions for making decisions. So they kind of pulled it all together for us to get a composite look. And shortly after that, they worked on a water budget for the island, which included groundwater recharge from rainfall, stream flows, evapotranspiration, and soil characteristics. The water budget was constructed on a seasonal basis. This was, the first work was done in cooperation with both the Commission and DHHL. The second effort was pursued by DHHL as a sponsor. Then a third effort, close on the heels of the second, was a numerical simulation of the groundwater flow system. This was a 2-dimensional steady state. Oh, sorry. Which gave us a better understanding of the groundwater flow, the distribution of hydraulic properties in order to construct the model to see how things flow from one place to another. And it also helped us test regional effects of withdrawals on both the water levels in other wells and in the coastal discharge. I think primarily it was only one existing well and one proposed well, since there's not a lot of wells there to test. But it was the beginning of a model to be able to show that they could construct this model and be able to demonstrate predictive capacities on what would happen to other water levels based on the pumping from one well. Now, the study that we are anticipating, hoping to come out sometime this year, is a 3-dimensional model which will take advantage of some new information as well, some new recharge data and some evapotranspiration data. It also, of course, has limits. It is going to estimate the effects of pumping on water levels and chlorides from existing wells, and they have the capacity now to test new well sites because they feel that the model that they were using, the 2D model, gave us a good foundation for taking a look at the broader issues for new well sites, and so that's what this proposes to do. You had a question?
Will that permit what-if scenarios only within the red area of Kuala Lumpur, or will it enable what-if scenarios outside of it? Say, just for example, Kukui.
Insofar as within the sector there are some different systems. For example, you have Kuala Lumpur, and then you have Mana Wainui, and then you have out in Ho'olahu, I think. Water is expected to move from one to the other, and so you would expect to be able to predict with some certainty, I guess, based on available data, how it's going to impact those kinds of wells. When you cross the sectoral boundary, I think you have somewhat less confidence in what might be the impact of pumping on one side compared to the other side.
And I would assume that when the model reaches a certain point of evolution, that its use will sort of replace the 5 million gallon paper sustainable yield, because we'll be able to say, well, if we pull 2 from here and 1 from there, you know, whatever the what-if scenario, then the 5 million gallon a day hard sustainable yield number kind of goes away. We would be operating under a different type of framework. Is that a correct assumption?
Well, I think to be fair, we have always operated under 2 kind of different bases. One is that the sustainable yields are planning numbers, so we try to encourage people to spread the pumpage across that to actually obtain the sustainable yield. When you have too many wells that are concentrated in a local area, you are trying to pull everything out of one straw, and we have found repeatedly that doesn't work.
And so it might only really be able to pull 4 if they're all here, but if they're one, so on, then
Right.
it could be 5.
Right, so in quite a few places, we found the concentration of wells can produce problems that need to be dealt with on a sort of a different basis, not just using sustainable yield numbers. If they interfere, we need to be able to control the pumpage from each. And we observe the chlorides and water levels along with that. So there are certain companion aspects of analysis.
I mean, is there any feel, I know it's, early stage and the model is not finished and peer-reviewed and in use, but is there any feel for whether there's likely to be additional amount of water beyond the 5 available in the bubble when we are able to look at modeling?
I don't know that they're looking at trying to figure what may be a different estimate of sustainable yield. I think their primary interest is in looking at the impact of pumping one well upon another well or upon ocean discharge. As to whether they feel like there is more water there for a sustainable yield question, I don't think they're addressing that.
I mean, that seems to be the $1,000,000 question here. I mean, how do we get to that?
Well, but by the same token, if you think of a more fine-grained analysis being the one that they are trying to produce, it gives us a better feel for actually how you space these wells. And that's probably more significant in the short term and in, I guess, the real life of planning for doing wells and developing your infrastructure. So it's, I think it would probably confirm what we suspect about generally saying to spread your pumpage across the aquifer.
And the draft water plan is coming out soon, and the model will not be complete, so I'm quite sure that it's not going to be incorporated in the evaluation of sustainable yields for the upcoming water plan. But I'm sure it's going to be another tool that can be used in the future to look at sustainable yields.
And one other factor that might affect things a little bit, and I forgive me if I'm remembering wrong, but wasn't there a request for a revised reservation from DHHL? Is that number staying the same? Staying the same?
I'm not aware of a revised request.
Okay. I take that one back.
Moving forward.
Not for Coahu anyway.
Okay.
Okay, your decision in December was to confirm the chair's authority to extend the deadline for comments and objections on new applications from well 17. The deadline was extended to March 14th of this year. There was a question of mediation, and that has been deferred. And the position statements from agencies also has been deferred as a consequence.
Charlie, dumb question, can you explain number 2? I'm just not tuned in quite yet. We did defer decision prior to returning to remand contested case hearing. Just, I don't know, there's too many words there. What does that mean?
Well, let me back up. There's an application for use of from well 17.
Got it.
And there is a statutory deadline of 90 days that we try to observe.
Sure.
And so the deadline for comments comes out of that, and deadlines for objection and so on.
Yeah, number 2 is one I don't get.
So because there was a lot of consternation about people feeling like there wasn't enough time to get their mind around it, and because they felt that the USGS report was gonna be instrumental to their position, they wanted to have the deadline extended. And so the chair has done so, and you confirmed her authority to do
Yes,
so.
number two.
So the deadline is extended to March 14th.
No, no.
But there
Oh,
was
I'm
a
sorry,
petition
I'm
for
sorry.
mediation of one by
Right.
DHHL.
When we had a status conference, calling all the parties together, because we had 3 applications that, as we defined, were in conflict in a variety of ways, they were concerned that they not have to move forward until they had a better picture of what's going on based on the USGS report. So they asked for it, for us to be able to go into mediation to see if they could sort out whatever might be the issues that they think are.
Prior to returning to remand contested case hearing, maybe I'm just,
Well, at this point,
Two separate things.
That's two
Yeah.
separate things.
at this point, we are sort of in suspension on that issue until March 14th at least, because that's the deadline. So whether or not there's going to be mediation can be taken up.
but has someone asked for a contested case based on the MPU application?
It's been remanded to a contested case by the court.
Oh, okay.
You're confusing two separate issues, Charlie. And this is a problem for the commission. Can-
We are, they are separate things, and you can clarify that afterwards.
Oh, okay, help me when you come up.
Yeah.
I'm still.
Yeah, I know that Dave has a different view of this.
Oh, okay.
I mean, would it not make sense to, before undertaking any other action, that contested case be dealt with in one form or another?
The parties have expressed the desire to go to mediation.
No.
Some parties.
We have an application from DHHL for a petition for mediation, and that was deferred.
The mediation is not connected to the contested case. The contested case is a separate issue. I think before anything is done in contested case, we'd have the parties brief on whether or not there's a need to continue the remanded contested case, and if so, what issues, but that's something that we're not dealing with yet, because, you know, the request for the petition for mediation has come in, so basically, anything to do with the contested case is on hold. We address it
Thank you.
through the mediation first.
I think I've seen this movie before. It's gonna be difficult to convince me that we should bypass the contested case process, not only because whenever that seems to have happened in the past, it has led to nightmarish disasters in process, but because, I mean, that seems to be the correct step forward, and it's been remanded to us by the courts to do a contested case. And then if the courts say do a contested case and we don't do it, then we are in default of not only our duties per the water code, but also by the will of the higher courts.
Right, well, there is some difference opinion about how to slice this, but I think it also could be said that if we were to proceed on a wholly new application without consideration of remand, we would be heading to a contested case anyway. I'd be willing to guarantee there's gonna be objections to this application, so I suppose you can look at this in a few different ways.
Yeah, thanks, I got what I needed.
So, obviously, we also you deferred decision on the pending applications until after March 14th, extended deadline.
But the timeline.
Yeah.
So there seems to be some concurrence that there should be mediation. Your commission has expressed some concern that its jurisdiction not be bound by agreements made in mediation. The parties have shown interest in digesting the results of this USGS study. And the USGS is uncertain about the timing of its report. I don't know, it seems that their alternate well site scenarios might still be run in March or April. That's what Steve Anthony was suggesting. So we don't know really when they will be ready to move forward with that. So my guess is that March 14th is going to come around and we're going to need to make a decision.
Well, since you mentioned the contested case that we were ordered by the courts to hold, could you, without opening a full briefing on the contested case, just give us kind of the Cliff's Notes version of what that contested case was to be about?
Before you answer, Charlie,
Yeah.
can I check with the
Yeah.
Deputy AG on what can be discussed
Yeah.
with respect to the contested case, just to make sure we're following?
I was not going to go into
Yeah.
detail.
Well, you know, one of the issues and one of the concerns that I've had when we held the status conference and everything in connection with the contested case is there are differing positions amongst the parties as to whether or not the remanded contested case is still alive, or whether or not it should just be dismissed and a new one started. And so the preference would be for the commission to get a briefing on it by the parties so that they can present their various positions on that issue before the commission makes a decision as to whether or not there is a contested case that was remanded to them that should be decided by the commission, or whether that remanded contested case should just be dismissed and a new one opened upon an application for a contested case based on the new water use permit applications.
And if we did that briefing, does that occur under HRS 91 or under HRS 92?
91. It would be part of the contested case to decide whether or not it should be dismissed or you know, what it would look like going forward.
Then without talking about any of the merits or any of the different sides, can we get just in 30 words or less what the court said about the contested case in the remand?
Can you answer that, Linda?
I don't have that at my fingertips.
Well, I can tell you just very briefly.
Really briefly.
This is very generally that there were 6 points that they mentioned that were subject to reconsideration for further proceedings. That's their word. One of which was the fact that they needed to have a new application to submit all of these as new uses. So that's the point of having that. But in terms of what the actual issues were, there were these other points that were not adequately covered, they felt, or needed to have further proceedings. In some cases, they felt that maybe it was in the record but not properly described. So there's a little bit of everything there.
Could you send us that pertinent document for somebody like?
Yeah, we'll send the decisions to you.
Yeah.
And I'm-
Yeah, I think it's actually available online too, right?
Send it.
We'll make sure you get
Yeah,
it.
thanks.
And I'm still trying to grasp how we approach it without opening a process. It could be many months or many years and increased complexity when it may not have to happen, because it seems like we're trying to move into new ground. I'm wondering if there's a mechanism where we can ask, the parties and the council to give us a quick read on what their thoughts are in a way that perhaps if they all point to one direction, then that can help us move in that way?
So because this is still a public meeting, even though it's a briefing, the people who are in attendance can provide testimony. I'm sure Mr. Franco would be more than happy to give you his views of why a contested case or remanded contested case is not necessary, and then the other parties can also give their views, but I think a more formal request for briefing from the parties would probably be appropriate.
And so,
Would be in the form of an order to them to just set forth a briefing schedule for them to bring this issue to the commission.
and that would be in the form of HRS 91. In other words, it in itself would be a contested case.
Yes.
So then we are kind of here jumping into having the contested case.
But you know, the upshot of that, or the result of that briefing by the parties could be that the commission agrees that there are no issues left from that case that need to be decided by the commission, and they could agree that it should be dismissed.
Okay, possible. Excuse me.
Well, that's essentially bringing it to a close.
I have one question that's been kind of going through my head. And whenever any of these cool charts kind of bounces above the green, what's happening in effect is that entities are borrowing water from the DHHL reservation. And I'm trying to understand the dynamics and implications of that, if there are any, since they're not using that water at this time, but it's a reservation, but it also is must be maintained.
Is there a question?
Yeah, I mean, what happens when, you know, we borrow water out of DHHL reservations?
Well, if that's a hypothetical, I'm not sure we are actually seeing that happen.
It's a reservation, it's not a current use. It's a reservation of the right to a future use.
Yes.
So there's no current.
So there's no implication.
No, no.
None, well,
Yeah, the
I'm
total
sure
pump,
DHHL attorney would say differently, but.
the actual pumpage is not endangering